Hello. Okay, I decided to review Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. Gabrielle Zevin? Yeah, Gabrielle Zevin. The reason I'm reviewing this is because basically I was at Edinburgh station and I had quite a long train journey and I went into Smith's and this was the number one book. I had a look at the back cover, of course, and it said it's about characters. It's a romance that's not a romance, and it had characters who were into video games. So it kind of appealed. So for me, another reason was I wanted to improve my writing, and I don't know what contemporary books are like. So this is obviously number one in the contemporary books chart, in Smith's at least, which is weird. Nobody goes to Smith's anymore anyway, but I did, so there we are. It also appealed because yes, it's about games, ostensibly from the 80s onwards, from 80s, 90s, and I personally have worked in data, have worked as a developer, and was into games big time in that time period. So for me, that all worked as a hook to get this book, which is not quite the same cover, which is obviously not the same cover as the one that I'm showing you in Goodreads there. But anyway, this is, I think, they mentioned this image as sort of an iconic image from the 90s that everybody had on their wall, at least the wave is anyway. I didn't. Anyhow, so what did I think about this? So first of all, quick summary. Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow is about several characters who play and make video games from the 80s onwards. It primarily tells the story of Sam and Sadie. It follows their relationship and their life's ups and downs and how it affects their relationship and their world in general. What worked for me? First of all, it's 470 pages, so the writing was great. I finished it in 3 or 4 days. It's an easy read, weirdly enough, despite it being that enormous. Which I suppose, I don't know if this is enormous these days. I know there are massively big books like Brendan Sanderson does. But anyway, 470 pages, and it was well paced. It kept me reading. It wasn't always there. There were parts where I thought, well, I just need to press on and I'll get to a much better bit. And in general I did, but she hooks you very well, and she leaves little questions in the air that you just want to know the answer to, and that worked really well. I was engaged. I found the characters interesting. They're not, and I'll come to that later. But anyway, some of the games talk as well. It made me nostalgic. For example, Monkey Island, I remember playing distinctly. Although it's got to be said, most of the games that I kind of played at the time were not big, were not on her list. I think one of the things is you've got to remember there were different. So she seems to have grown up in a time, or grown up with a laptop, a PC in the 80s, which was really rare. It was a rich person's, certainly as for a kid to play with, it was a rich person's thing in the 80s, a PC. They were really, really, really expensive, and they were just coming out, to be honest, and they weren't a games platform. What was the big games platform at the time was things like Commodore or Atari, So I had like a Commodore 64 and eventually an Amiga, and that carried me through most of the 80s and 90s. And it wasn't until the late 90s that I got a PC, by which time they're going into the fictional games that they're creating. So I can kind of relate things like, as I say, Monkey Island, Leisure Suit Larry, which I never played, but Leisure Suit Larry was about a Lothario, as far as I understand it, and it's weird that she brings it up. But anyway, things like Leisure Suit Larry made me go, oh yeah, I remember that kind of thing. Yeah, but it did make me feel nostalgic, certainly for games, and certainly every now and again she mentions a game that I go, oh yeah, okay. She mentions about Full Metal Solid, which I never played. Full Gear Metal Solid, I think it's called, Full Metal. Anyway, the reason I find that funny is because there's a Dara O'Brien joke about it, about Snake, and I just find that it's probably my favourite joke of all time. Anyway, I digress. I'm completely going off the book. Yeah, as I say, I thought the Games Talk was great. I thought the arcade games actually were something that I could completely relate to. Donkey Kong and Pac-Man, Miss Pac-Man, even. The info dumps I thought for the book were excellent. I thought, for example, she did info dumps via things like interviews, and I thought that was really excellent way of doing it. It also worked to hook really well as well, because she didn't have to. She could keep assumptions between the interviewer and the interviewee that weren't actually then explored at the time, but hooked you. Really well done. I thought that was great. I thought the end was pretty good. This is obviously not an action adventure. It's a romance, if not actually a romance. And from that point of view, it delivers. You end up feeling, yeah, good. I won't go any further. Right, now what didn't work for me? Okay, the characters were flawed characters, there's no doubt about it. But I didn't really like them. They pretty much all came from a place of privilege and entitlement. And that made it difficult for me to relate. I mean, Sadie certainly does. One of the other main characters certainly does. But they all seem to. There's virtually none of them. Even Sam, who supposedly doesn't come from particularly massive privilege, seems to have a background where he's got a pretty good, or grandparents and parents who are doing pretty well, frankly. So it's all, there's not real struggle here for any of them. Not that I particularly want struggle, and not particularly that necessarily has to be, but I think the thing is it makes it very hard to relate to these characters. They don't really, the writing doesn't understand struggle, I think. That's probably a bit harsh, but that's kind of how it felt to me. Because it's a bit soulless. They're not heartwarming characters, and therefore everything feels a little bit flat, a little bit, maybe the arguments feel a little bit petty and sort of first world arguments, that's as you'd say. Then next up there's no getting away from it. At times this is also a massive woke tick box exercise, which means you instantly know who the heroes and the villains are going to be. It makes it quite predictable in places, and there are woke tropes, lots of them. I won't go into what they are, but you know, it's predictable pretty much. I think though the author knows this, and while she nods to it, she does quickly move on from the woke tropes. From a technical perspective, I mean, I've produced software, although nothing like a game, tiny bits of software. I've worked in data. It doesn't feel like it captures the development process, the excitement of finishing, the fun of development, and it can be, and that's not even games. I haven't gone into anything nearly as creative as games, but I could imagine it feels, and it doesn't capture this feeling of excitement or pride at what you've created, or so I don't get that at all from the book. They kind of like it. It feels like it a bit, but not much. And also not so much the playing of video games. I don't know what it is. It's they love playing games, and I loved playing games, but she doesn't really put across how great it is when you're in the moment, when you absolutely have to play a game. I mean, it must be said, I've not played like that for a long, long time, so I would struggle with that as well. But when you're absolutely lost in a game, you have to keep playing, and you have to keep playing, and you have to keep playing. I don't think it gets that across that well. There were parts of the book where I was a bit bored, to be honest. Possibly where they should have had much more emotive highs, but it sort of it dragged out. I didn't. There were parts where I didn't think this was gripping me, and yet I pressed on because there were some hidden questions there that you just wanted to know the answer to. Some of the key characters appear relatively late and are not massively developed. I won't go into any more depth on that because it would spoil it, but I just don't think there are certain scenes where you just think, hang on, that's not really explained brilliantly, and you don't really understand the character that's in there. It's key scenes. Okay, some of the choices are a bit. There's a choice to make a game that shocks, and I don't really understand why. I don't really understand what it was there for. It possibly there's a hidden message in it, but it was a bit too hidden for me, and I don't really understand why it was done. Anyway, so that's for me that's the positives and the negatives of the book. I'd give it a 3 out of 5. The book, it's not aimed at me. I don't think it's not aimed at, despite it being set in the 90s and the noughties when I would have been playing games, and the 80s. And obviously I also have been developing games. The characters, they're not great characters, and they don't hook me, I don't think. I think there's better stuff out there to read. I think there's better stuff to watch or play. I personally, I can't recommend this book. I don't think it's aimed at me. I think it's aimed at perhaps someone like Gabrielle Zevin, who's 10 years younger than me, maybe, and is female, and I think that's probably what it is. It's probably more aimed at a female gamer, but then again, that makes total sense, because 80% of book readers are 80% of people who read books are women, so yes, completely makes sense. Anyway, what it does make me want to do is go and play Monkey Island. So I might try and do that. Hope you enjoy that review.